Waverly Hills Sanatorium, perched ominously atop a hill in Louisville, Kentucky, is one of the most infamous haunted locations in the United States. Originally opened in 1910 as a tuberculosis hospital, Waverly Hills was designed to be a state-of-the-art facility meant to treat patients suffering from the deadly disease. The hospital boasted large windows to allow fresh air to flow through the rooms and a vast open space to promote healing through nature. However, as tuberculosis spread rapidly, the sanatorium became overcrowded, and conditions within the facility deteriorated. At the height of the epidemic, Waverly Hills housed over 400 patients, many of whom were subjected to experimental treatments that were often brutal and ineffective. These included procedures like lung removals, rib resections, and the infamous sun therapy, where patients were exposed to the elements in a desperate attempt to cure them. Unfortunately, many of these treatments led to painful deaths, contributing to the sanatorium's grim reputation. It's said that over 60,000 souls met their end at Waverly, and many believe those souls never left. As I stepped through the iron gates of Waverly Hills Sanatorium, the air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the weight of the past still clung to the atmosphere. The sprawling structure loomed ahead, its Gothic architecture casting jagged shadows in the dim light of the setting sun. I had always been fascinated by stories of haunted places, but nothing had prepared me for the overwhelming sense of dread that washed over me as I approached the main entrance. The moment I stepped inside, it felt like stepping back in time. The once pristine walls were now crumbling, the paint peeling like the skin of a long-dead corpse. The silence was absolute, save for the occasional creak of the decaying floorboards beneath my feet. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic, like old blood. I made my way down the long, narrow hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. Each door I passed seemed to hold its own secrets, the rooms beyond filled with memories of pain and suffering. As I reached the end of the corridor, I found myself standing before a large set of double doors. They were slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered from within. I pushed the doors open slowly, the creak of the hinges sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. Inside was the old operating room, where countless lives had been lost in the name of medicine. The operating table was still there, rusted and stained with age. The metal instruments, once used to cut and slice, were strewn across a nearby counter, their sharp edges glinting in the dim light. Suddenly a noise, a soft whisper broke the silence. My heart raced as I turned, but there was nothing there, just the empty room and the oppressive silence. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as my imagination, but then I heard it again. This time it was clearer, more distinct, a low, guttural voice murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. My eyes were drawn to the far corner of the room, where a shadow seemed to be moving. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when suddenly, the shadow surged forward, growing larger and darker until it seemed to envelop the entire room. Panic surged through me and I stumbled back, crashing into the counter behind me. The instruments clattered to the floor, but I didn't dare take my eyes off the shadow. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was still again, but the sense of unease lingered, stronger than before. My hands were trembling as I backed out of the room, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I turned and bolted down the hallway, desperate to escape the oppressive darkness that seemed to follow me. But as I reached the entrance, something caught my eye. Movement, just outside the front doors. I froze, my blood running cold as I saw a figure standing there, shrouded in shadows. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me. And then in a flash, it was gone. I blinked, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just seen. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run as far away from this place as possible. But something held me back. A morbid curiosity, perhaps, or the nagging feeling that this was just the beginning. With trembling hands, I reached for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I stepped out of the building and into the night. The wind howled through the trees and I could almost hear it. The faint echo of voices carried on the breeze, whispering secrets long forgotten. As I made my way back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something or someone was following me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again, but the night was empty, save for the rustling leaves and the distant call of an owl. I reached the car, my heart pounding in my chest as I fumbled with the keys. As I finally got the door open and slid into the driver's seat, I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm the fear that had taken hold of me. But just as I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a flash of movement in the back seat. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat, but the back seat was empty. I stared at the darkness, my pulse racing before forcing myself to turn back around. I was just about to put the car in drive when a cold hand clamped down on my shoulder, sending a shock of terror through my entire body. I screamed, spinning around again, but there was no one there. The back seat was as empty as before, but the fear remained, clinging to me like a second skin. My heart was racing, my hands shaking as I finally put the car in drive and sped away from Waverly Hills, the shadows of the sanatorium looming in my rearview mirror. But even as I drove away, I couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed me. That something from Waverly Hills had latched onto me and wasn't going to let go. And in that moment I knew I would have to go back. I would have to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. Because something was waiting for me at Waverly Hills. Something dark and ancient. Something that wasn't done with me yet. The drive home from Waverly Hills was a blur of anxiety and dread. The cold grip on my shoulder, the shadowy figure, the whispering voices. They all haunted me, replaying in my mind like a broken record. By the time I reached the safety of my own home, I was drenched in sweat, my nerves frayed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside my window seemed amplified, twisting my fear into vivid nightmares. The next morning I woke up groggy and unrested. Despite my exhaustion, something compelled me to return to Waverly Hills. I told myself it was to find closure, to prove that what I had experienced was just the result of an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew there was something more. Something unfinished. Something waiting for me back at the sanatorium. By the time I arrived at Waverly Hills again, the sun was already sinking below the horizon, casting long shadows over the decaying structure. The atmosphere felt even heavier this time, as if the building itself was aware of my return. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the entrance, the once grand double doors now hanging on rusted hinges. I hesitated before stepping inside, every instinct telling me to turn back. But I pushed the fear down, steeled myself, and crossed the threshold once more. The air inside was colder than before, almost unnaturally so. The long corridor stretched out before me, dark and foreboding. But this time I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint light emanating from somewhere deeper within the building. Curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of dread, propelled me forward. As I moved through the halls, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the very walls were alive with malevolent intent. My footsteps echoed unnervingly, each step bringing me closer to the source of the light. Eventually, I found myself standing outside the morgue, the door slightly ajar. The light was coming from within. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I pushed the door open, revealing the stark, sterile room beyond. The morgue was eerily intact, the cold storage drawers lining the walls like silent sentinels, waiting for their next victim. But what caught my attention was the old autopsy table in the center of the room. It was illuminated by a single, flickering bulb that swung gently from the ceiling, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The table wasn't empty. Something was laid out on it, covered by a stained white sheet. My stomach churned as I approached the table, the overwhelming smell of decay assaulting my senses. With trembling hands, I reached out and slowly pulled back the sheet, revealing a body underneath. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the corpse was fresh, too fresh. The face was twisted in agony, the skin pale and lifeless. But what made my blood run cold was the fact that I recognized the person. It was me. I stumbled back, the room spinning around me. My heart was racing, my mind refusing to comprehend what I was seeing. How could it be possible? How could I be staring at my own dead body? Panic surged through me, and I turned to flee, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping me inside. The light above flickered violently, casting the room in darkness for a split second before illuminating it once more. But in that brief moment of darkness, something had changed. The morgue drawers began to rattle, the metal banging against the walls as if something, or someone, was trying to escape. I backed away from the table, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath in the air, forming clouds of condensation. The rattling grew louder, more frantic, and then one by one the drawers began to slide open. A low, guttural moan filled the room, echoing off the cold, tiled walls. I watched in horror as skeletal hands began to emerge from the open drawers, the dead coming to life before my very eyes. Their eyes, hollow and empty, locked onto me as they dragged themselves out of their metal tombs, their movements slow and jerky, like marionettes controlled by an unseen hand. I was frozen in place, terror gripping me as the dead approached. Their flesh hung from their bones in ragged strips, their mouths opening and closing as if trying to speak, but only producing guttural, inhuman sounds. They were reaching for me, their cold fingers inches away from my skin when the light suddenly cut out, plunging the room into complete darkness. My scream died in my throat as the room went silent, the oppressive blackness swallowing me whole. I was disoriented, unable to see or hear anything. And then, just as suddenly as the darkness had come, the lights flickered back on, revealing an empty room. The corpses were gone. the drawers closed, and the body on the table had vanished. My mind reeled as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I was alone again, but the fear hadn't left me. It had only grown stronger, more intense. I had to get out. I had to leave before whatever was in this place decided to take me for real. I bolted for the door, flinging it open and sprinting down the hall. The building seemed to close in around me, the walls narrowing, the shadows growing longer. Every turn I made felt like a maze, each corridor leading me deeper into the bowels of the sanatorium. I finally found the staircase that led to the main floor and took the steps 2 at a time, the oppressive darkness chasing me as I ran. The air felt thicker here, as if the very atmosphere was trying to suffocate me, to keep me from escaping. I burst through the door at the top of the stairs and into the entrance hall, the cool night air a welcome relief against my flushed skin. But as I reached for the front doors, they slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. I pulled at the handles, desperate to escape, but they wouldn't budge. Panic rose in my chest as I frantically searched for another way out, but every door, every window was sealed tight, trapping me inside. And then, the whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. The voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding me, filling my head with their tortured words. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. The voices grew louder, more demanding, until they were all I could hear. Suddenly the room began to spin, the floor tilting beneath me as the walls closed in. The whispers turned into screams, agonized, tortured screams that echoed in my skull, reverberating off the walls of my mind. I felt a hand close around my ankle, cold and clammy, pulling me down. I screamed, kicking out at whatever was holding me, but the grip only tightened, dragging me toward the shadows that pooled in the corners of the room. My vision blurred, the world spinning faster and faster until I could no longer tell up from down, right from left. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The room was still, the whispers gone, the grip on my ankle vanished. I was alone again, lying on the cold, hard floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't move, didn't dare to. The silence was deafening, more terrifying than the screams had been. I knew, deep down, that whatever was haunting Waverly Hills wasn't done with me yet. The real terror was still to come. And as I lay there, staring up at the decaying ceiling, I realized that there was no escape. Waverly Hills had claimed me, just as it had claimed so many before, and I was powerless to stop it, because the sanatorium had its own plans for me. And it was only just beginning. The days following my last visit to Waverly Hills were a blur of fear and paranoia. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound carried an ominous weight, and the feeling that I was being watched never left me. I tried to carry on with my life, to pretend that everything was normal, but the mark on my shoulder, the whispered words in my ear when I was alone, and the dark dreams that haunted my sleep made it clear that normal was a distant memory. I became obsessed with the words scrawled in blood on the tunnel wall. "He's waiting for you. Asterisk, asterisk." I knew I had to confront whatever had attached itself to me, but the thought of returning to Waverly Hills filled me with a dread so profound it nearly paralyzed me. Yet there was no other choice. If I didn't face it, I feared that whatever had taken hold of me would eventually consume me entirely. One final time, I drove back to Waverly Hills, the sky above overcast and dark, as if the world itself was bracing for what was to come. The sanatorium loomed ahead, its broken windows like the hollow eyes of a corpse, watching, waiting. As I stepped out of the car, the air was still, unnaturally so, as if the entire world had fallen silent in anticipation. With trembling hands, I pocketed my flashlight and stepped through the iron gates for what I knew would be the last time. The interior of the sanatorium was unchanged, dark, decaying, and filled with an oppressive energy that pressed down on me from all sides. But there was something different this time. Something more intense, more malevolent. I could feel it in the air, in the way the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. As I walked through the halls, the sense of anticipation grew, the silence broken only by the distant echo of my footsteps. I had no plan, no clear idea of what I was supposed to do. All I knew was that I had to go back to the place where this nightmare had begun, the morgue. Whatever awaited me there, I had to face it head-on. The corridor leading to the morgue was darker than I remembered, the air colder. As I approached the door, I heard it, the familiar whispering. But this time it was louder, more insistent, as if the voices were trying to warn me, or perhaps lure me deeper into the abyss. I pushed open the door, and the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. The morgue was the same, yet different. The autopsy table was gone, replaced by a circle of candles that burned with a sickly green flame. The walls were covered in symbols I didn't recognize, scrawled in what looked like dried blood. And in the center of the room stood a figure, a man, or what once was a man, draped in tattered black robes that seemed to shift and move like living shadows. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and piercing. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied, as if reacting to his presence. "You've come," the figure said, his voice low and raspy, like the sound of dry leaves being crushed underfoot. "Just as I knew you would." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "I am the one who waits, the one who feeds. And you, my dear, are the one who will open the door." I took a step back, my heart racing. "What do you mean?" He lifted a hand, and I felt an invisible force wrap around me, pulling me forward, closer to the circle of candles. I struggled, but it was no use. Whatever power he wielded was far stronger than I could resist. "Waverly Hills is a gateway," the figure continued. "A place where the veil between the living and the dead is thin, where the souls of the damned linger, waiting for release. And you have been chosen to be the key." The mark on my shoulder burned, and I cried out in pain as the figure's words took hold. I could feel something inside me stirring. Something dark and ancient. Something that had been waiting for this moment. The whispers grew deafening, filling my mind with their twisted words, and I realized with growing horror that I was losing control. "No!" I gasped, struggling against the force that held me. "I won't do it! I won't let you use me!" The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You have no choice. The mark is upon you, and the door will open, whether you will it or not." Suddenly the candles flared, their green, flames rising high, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The symbols began to glow, pulsating with an otherworldly light, and I felt the ground beneath me begin to tremble. The figure raised both hands, chanting in a language I couldn't understand, and I felt the darkness within me surge, pushing against the edges of my consciousness, trying to break free. I screamed, falling to my knees as the pain became unbearable, my vision blurring as the room around me seemed to twist and warp. But then, in the midst of the chaos, I heard something, faint at first but growing stronger. It was the sound of a voice, a familiar voice, calling my name. I clung to it, using it as an anchor, a lifeline to pull myself back from the brink. "No!" I screamed, fighting with every ounce of strength I had left. "I won't let you take me!" With a final desperate push, I reached deep within myself, grasping at the last remnants of my will, and forced the darkness back, sealing it away. The pain subsided, the burning on my shoulder fading to a dull ache, and the room around me began to stabilize. The figure staggered back, a hiss of anger escaping from beneath his hood. "You cannot resist forever," he snarled. "The door will open, and when it does, you will be mine." But I wasn't listening. With the last of my strength, I grabbed the nearest candle and hurled it at the figure. The green flame engulfed him, and he shrieked, his robes catching fire as he stumbled back, the symbols on the walls flickering and dying. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, sprinting down the hall, the sanatorium shaking around me as the forces within it began to unravel. The whispers had turned to screams, desperate and pleading, as if the very souls of Waverly Hills were crying out for release. I burst through the front doors and into the night, the cold air a shock against my flushed skin as I ran to my car. The building behind me groaned, the walls cracking, the roof caving in, as if the very foundation of the sanatorium was crumbling under the weight of its own darkness. I didn't stop. Didn't look back until I was miles away. The lights of the sanatorium long gone, swallowed by the night. Only then did I pull over, my hands trembling as I tried to catch my breath. But even as I sat there, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away, I knew that it wasn't over. The mark on my shoulder was still there, a constant reminder of the darkness that had touched me. And though I had fought it back, I knew that it was only a matter of time before it would return, stronger than before. Waverly Hills might have been destroyed, but the entity that had waited within its walls was still out there, still waiting, still hungry. And it wouldn't stop until it had claimed me, body and soul. As I started the car and drove away, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and the faintest whisper in my ear. He's still waiting. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun.